So today I'm going to be speaking about my recent research into Karl Briullov's painting, The Last Day of Pompeii. This is research that I published just last year. Now that article delves into the politics of the French art world, French political situation in general. Today I'll be focusing more on Russian aspects. We'll definitely be spending some time in Paris though. So the painting that we're looking at, Karl Briullov's Last Day of Pompeii, depicts a chaotic scene of panic and destruction. We are looking down a long street towards Mount Vesuvius, which we see erupting in the background there in the upper right corner. You can see that volcanic ash is raining down on the entire scene. A lurid light from thunderbolts in the sky is clashing with fiery lava that is streaming down the sides of Mount Vesuvius. Sculptures are plunging from the rooftops and buildings start to tilt and crumble. We see people in the foreground trying to flee the city. They are protecting their children. They're trying to rescue elderly relatives. Some people have already perished in the disaster. So we see this crowded, panic-stricken, disastrous scene. Now let's look at the painting in the State Russian Museum where it appears today. And you can see that it's a very large scale work. And it was painted by the leading Russian artist of his day, Karl Briullov. Now, in many ways, this painting is famous simply for being famous. It became famous in Rome when Briullov was painting it in around 1830. In Milan, where it first appeared in public in 1833, it became a sensation. It had absolutely outstanding popular and critical acclaim in Milan. And then in Paris, where it received a first-class medal at the Salon of 1834, as well as extensive press coverage. And of course, that's our focus for today. So all of this international attention made Briullov a hero back home in Russia. And since that time, since the 1830s, The Last Day of Pompeii has become a canonical work of art. It was the first painting by a Russian artist to receive international attention, to attain this kind of recognition in Western Europe. And it's really one of the few Russian paintings from the first half of the 19th century that European art historians are likely to know. So I just want to emphasize that it's a canonical work, and those of you who have been to St. Petersburg to the State Russian Museum have definitely seen it. So what has always puzzled me about this painting is that despite its official recognition in Paris, according to the scholarship, the reviews of the painting in Paris were always negative, were negative. In fact, the reviews were scathing. So I wanted to try and find out what happened and why there was this mismatch between the official recognition and the press recognition. So the scholarly literature, as I was doing my research, I found that the scholarly literature tended to quote one negative review over and over again. And I wanted to look for more reviews. So when I started my research, I eventually found about 40 French newspapers in all, and most of those reviews actually mentioned The Last Day of Pompeii. Some of them only looked at French artists, but the ones that looked at a more broad spectrum mentioned Last Day of Pompeii, and over a dozen critics gave the painting really substantial, thoughtful reviews. So I think even more interesting, in the course of my research, I unexpectedly discovered a dossier of letters in the French National Archives, and that shed some new light on the painting's history. So today I'm going to share that research with you, and I'm going to be sharing for the first time those letters from the archive, from that dossier that I actually haven't showed to anyone before. I've quoted them in my research, but I haven't shown them. So this is a first look. So in my research, I found that the reviews in the newspapers and the different pamphlets published were, some of them were actually positive. Some of them were negative, of course, some of them were positive, but the press attention in itself was significant. And when analyzing the coverage, I discovered that there were several factors that shaped the criticism. First, of course, there were political issues within the French art world that were going on, and I'll just touch on those briefly. There was also the long aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, and also France's reputation within Europe on the European scene. This had happened just 20 years earlier, so it wasn't that long before the painting's exhibition. And there was also misinformation about Briullov himself that appeared in the public that I found shaped the criticism. So before we delve into that, let's look at the story behind the production, the creation of Last Day of Pompeii. Karl Pavlovich Briullov studied at the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg from the age of 10. And his father was a decorative wood carver with the title of academician. And his whole family was artistic. So his brothers were variously icon painters, architects, and he himself was a history painter. So young Karl was truly a golden boy at the academy. He won prizes at every level of his training. And in his final year, he won the highest prize. That was the major gold medal in history painting. That won him a 3-year stipend to study abroad, to study in Rome. So Rome at the time was an international center for ambitious artists. The French Academy in Rome had been established in the 17th century, but of course, other countries also sent their top graduates from their academies. Russia did the same. Starting in the 18th century, Russia had sent its top graduates to Rome also to Paris, but in this period after the Napoleonic Wars, to Rome to study antiquity, to look at the artworks of the Renaissance and Baroque artists, and to just become part of that international milieu. There was what we call a sort of Russian colony in Rome at the time. So not only these artists who were under the care of the ambassador, but also there were writers and other travelers, aristocrats. Remember, Nikolai Gogol was in Rome at the time. So there was this whole little Russian colony there. So really across Europe, wealthy patrons had resumed the grand tour to Italy and various other places across in Europe, but especially to Rome after the Napoleonic Wars. So once in Rome, Briullov arrived there in 1823. He had several important obligations. He had to send regular reports back to the Society for the Encouragement of Artists, which had funded his travel. So these reports would tell them what museums he was going to, what he was seeing, how he was spending his time. And he also had to send works that demonstrated his progress. So his most important work would be a capstone project, and that was the major painting, the Большая Картина. And that would be a multi-figure history painting on a serious subject that would show that everything he'd accomplished. So like many young men studying abroad, Briullov had lots of distractions. Most significantly, he had a lot of commissions from Russian aristocrats who wanted portraits, from various collectors who wanted scenes from everyday life in Italy, and various other things going on. So his letters from this period back home to his brothers and to the Imperial Society of the Encouragement of Artists, his letters are just full of assurances that he's just about to start his major painting. Really, after I finish this project, I'll get on it. Actually, it took him about 4 or 5 years to get started, but he was by that time trying the patience of the society. So Briullov visited Pompeii in 1827, and here we see a publication from that period. He settled on a subject for his painting in March of 1828, according to his correspondence. And while in Pompeii, he had sketched the most recently excavated area of the city, namely the Street of Tombs, which we see here. This is a publication from that period called Pompeiana, and in front of us we see this very distinctive tomb that appears in his painting. So we know that Briullov would have appeared here to the left of this tomb, and he was looking down the Street of Tombs in this direction. So from the left to the right of this image that we see here. And when you look at the painting again, you'll be able to see this tomb on your left with those steps in front of it. It's very distinctive. So Pompeii at this time in the 1830s was a historical subject, but it was also a current event, a current subject. Mount Vesuvius was an active volcano, and it was erupting fairly regularly in the late 18th century, in the early 19th century, even right around the time that Briullov was there were eruptions going on. So it was the subject of regular, the eruptions were in the press. And then when the excavations were going on of Pompeii, these publications like this one, illustrated publications of what was being found would appear, often in luxury albums. There was also an opera that was that Briullov saw, an opera by Giovanni Pacini called The Last Day of Pompeii. And after Briullov saw the opera in 1828 in Milan, we think this is probably what served as a catalyst for his making the painting. There had been a whole trend of disaster paintings in Europe in the 18-teens, 1820s. So not only subjects like Pompeii, but also floods and shipwrecks, alpine snowstorms, things like that were fueling the imagination of Russian artists. So Briullov's Pompeii is really part of that larger trend. So young Briullov presented a sketch of Pompeii to Count Anatoly Demidov, whom we see here. And Demidov then commissioned Briullov to paint this painting, to paint The Last Day of Pompeii, as well as this equestrian portrait that we see. So I want to say that Demidov at this time in 1828 was only 17 years old. He was born into one of the wealthiest aristocratic families in Russia. They were wealthy from metal production, so from iron and steel, and then later gold, copper, silver, and so on. So this extraordinarily wealthy family, 17-year-old young man living as an expatriate in Paris, and he went on to become a noted connoisseur and art collector. So the support that Briullov received from Demidov was really crucial because it meant that he could then refuse the support that he'd been getting, the stipends that he'd been getting from the Society for the Encouragement of Artists. They were breathing down his neck about finishing his large painting, and he just wanted to stop. He wanted to be able to stop sending back reports to them. So he finally was free of their oversight, and he could just support himself with Demidov and other smaller commissions. So as the work neared completion, Briullov's studio became a destination for visitors to Rome. So local notables also appeared, but visitors from Russia, visitors from other countries, people like Sir Walter Scott and Stendhal apparently visited his studio to see this painting. And so there was quite a buzz in Rome about the painting as he finished it, and everyone was reportedly very impressed with the work. So Briullov then sent the painting, once it was finished, he sent it to Milan. There it appeared at an annual exhibition at the Academy of Arts, where Briullov sent his work regularly. But this time, this painting created an absolute sensation. Crowds gathered before the painting. Briullov became a total celebrity in the city. Admirers were following him around in the street, and this has been in the newspapers. There are a lot of reports about his treatment after the painting went on view. Apparently, when he went to the theater, people saw him in the audience and stood up and applauded him. They started reciting poetry in his honor. So he was really a kind of a rock star in Milan. The British author Edward Bulwer-Lytton saw the painting in Milan and then went on to write a novel, The Last Days of Pompeii, that became a bestseller. So all of this shows the major impact of Briullov's work in Italy. After the exhibition in Milan, Briullov also received lots of official honors in Italy. So he became an honorary member in 5 different Italian art academies, and the Uffizi Gallery in Florence invited him to contribute a self-portrait to its renowned collection of artist self-portraits that dated back to the Renaissance. So this was the painting here that I'm showing you that he made for the Uffizi, but he got busy with other things and never completed it. So it did not appear there. To give you a sense of how Italians saw the painting, one writer called it, quote, a new era in painting. Another one said that any comparison with the work of past artists would be inappropriate. So yet another writer compared Briullov to Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian, saying that it had this emotional power, this innovation, and a timelessness that put him in the ranks of these Renaissance masters. So after this, in 1833, when this exhibition happened, Briullov was absolutely on top of the art world. So after the success in Italy, we know that the painting was exhibited in Paris, but scholars had never been sure why, whose initiative it was to send it there. Was it Demidov's idea, the patrons, or was it the Society for the Encouragement of Artists who decided, after all, to support Briullov in sending it there? Or was it some French organization that maybe invited and funded his sending it to Paris? We simply weren't sure. But in the French archives, I was able to find the answer. So this is a letter from the Russian ambassador to France, Carlo Andrea Pozzo di Borgo. And he's writing to the director of National Museums, Auguste de Forbin. And the ambassador in the letter describes the painting. He tells of its success in Italy and says, Monsieur Briullov has expressed to me the desire to see it shown at the museum's exhibition. So somebody may have suggested this idea to Briullov, but according to this letter, the initiative came from the artist himself. So when Pozzo di Borgo says the museum's exhibition, here he's referring to an event known as the Salon or the Salon. Now, what we're looking at here is a print showing the Salon in the late 18th century. This is a Paris exhibition that was held on a regular basis in the Louvre Palace in a room called the Salon Carré, or the Square Salon. And that Square Salon was what gave the exhibition its name. It was kind of Salon was kind of a nickname for this exhibition. In the 18th century, which we see here, only members of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture could exhibit their works at the Salon. But by the 19th century, it was open to non-members. And in fact, there was international participation. Most of the exhibitors were French, but really anyone could submit their work and have it judged, have it judged by the jury to hope to be admitted. So that was the process. You would, if you wanted to have your work shown, you would submit your work in February to the jury. The jury consisted of members of the Royal Academy, and they would decide whether to accept or reject it. The exhibition took place from the 1st of March until May. And at the close of each exhibition, the king would award prizes and would award commissions to the most successful artists. So having your work exhibited at the Salon, having it pass the jury was a tremendously big deal for artists. Very few foreign artists submitted their works, but those who did were really the most ambitious of artists. So by the 19th century, the exhibition had grown too big for the Salon, that Square Salon that we just saw. So here we see the exhibition expanding and stretching all the way down the Grand Galerie of the Louvre along the Seine River. It had really become the largest exhibition of contemporary art in Europe. It contained thousands of works for these 2 months that it was open. These were paintings of all sizes, sculptures, prints, including lithographs, drawings, pastels, miniatures, just every kind of fine art that you could imagine was on view. And actually we can see in this painting, right, the artist is depicting this crowd of people at 4 o'clock in the late afternoon at the Salon, very tired, exhausted from looking at all these different works and getting a bit cranky when it's about to close. So in 1834, when Briullov's painting went on view, there were over 2,500 works in the exhibition. Yeah, over 2,500. So it was a huge event, and it was open to the general public. So it was very, very popular. So I was interested in finding out, how did Briullov's painting do with the jury? Did they have any comments on it when he submitted it? And this was another new revelation from the archive in a letter from Anatoly Demidov, which we see here. He's now 20 years old. And this, he is writing to the director of national museums, referring to that letter that we had just seen from November 7th, from the ambassador. And he says to the director of national museums, this infinitely obliging letter that you wrote to the ambassador on the 8th of November, showing that Forbin, the director of museums, had responded to the ambassador the very next day. And he had admitted Briullov's painting to the exhibition, totally bypassing the jury. Very interesting. So also in the same letter, he wrote, he wrote, might I dare to hope that you would add to your kindness by having it placed in the long salon in order that it might be lit by suitable daylight. So here he shows that he's this very confident young man. Remember, he's only 20 at this time, and he's making a special request to this very high-placed official in the French bureaucracy. It also shows that he doesn't know the salon protocol. It's totally inappropriate for him to make a request like this. And he also doesn't know the terminology. It's not the salon long, right, that he writes here. As we've seen, it's either the salon carré, the square salon, or the grande galerie. So he's kind of confusing his terms. So any of us who've ever dealt with an entitled, badly informed 20-year-old young man, overconfident, we've dealt with the likes of Anatoly Demidov. We know exactly what he's up to. So in his next letter, Demidov writes to Alphonse de Cailleux, who's taken over the direction of the exhibition, and he sends a progress report saying that it's just arriving at the Louvre any day now, and he again requests to hang it where it will be lit well. He says, he adds, as an afterthought here, he adds, in the Salon Carré, please put it in the right place. So he has the right term now, but he includes it with a little hash mark between the lines, and he looks like he's just dipped his pen in the ink and written it with fresh dark ink to kind of add an emphasis, like a boldface way of emphasizing his request. Well, it turns out that Demidov need not worry about where the painting would be hung because the Salon Carré was the only proper place for a painting like this. According to tradition, this was the spot for large-scale history paintings like the Last Day of Pompeii. So having a painting hung at the Salon Carré was a mark of recognition. It was a mark of having arrived on the scene, and that is exactly what happened with Pompeii. So here we see the Salon jury deliberations from the 14th of February. This is the day that Briullov's painting appeared before the jury. And in the left, we can see I've circled his name, painting number 1458. They don't bother giving the title, but we do see here that it was admitted, right? It was admitted and not rejected. Of course, that was just a formality because we know that it had been accepted months earlier. On the right is the final painting from the 14th of February. They'd seen hundreds of paintings that day, and here all of these academicians sign off their approval. So in the archives, I also learned that Briullov didn't travel to Paris himself, and that was something that we hadn't known before. He entrusted the painting to shippers and art handlers to take it to the Louvre. And also on the receiving end, Demidov would be responsible for the paperwork to submit it to the jury, as well as Demidov also commissioned a local specialist to varnish it and to create this immense gilded frame where it would be shown in the Louvre. So now let's return to Briullov's masterpiece to see how it was received in Paris at the 1834 Salon. There were dozens of newspapers, tons of art criticism going on at the time, and the critics were nearly unanimous. They judged that the Last Day of Pompeii was a very ambitious but flawed work by a highly talented artist. So I was interested in finding out what they objected to. And according to the criticism, they found technical flaws in his lighting effects and some of his rendering of space. They also judged it harshly for the lack of realism and what they saw as being theatrical and melodramatic. A lot of them some of them, I should say, just objected to the fact that it was an academic painting. They said that it really belonged to the previous generation of artists, that it was something like the production of Jacques-Louis David and his students rather than a contemporary work of art. So it was interesting to me when I saw that in the criticism of Pompeii, the painting really became a kind of scapegoat for a larger argument about the value of history painting within the French art world. For conservative critics, academic painting was good. And so Pompeii was a strong painting for that reason. The fact that it was in this category was a virtue. But for progressive critics, and here I mean both politically progressive as well as progressive artistically, aesthetically, for these progressive, academic painting was representative of the old regime. And it's something that France really needed to move past. So even the most negative criticism also had words of praise, as we'll see. But I wanted to find out what was behind all of the negative criticism. And so one thing that I realized was that there were essentially two different cultures of art criticism going on. That is to say, we Russianists were reading the French criticism with the kind of Russian eyes. We were thinking about what Russian art criticism was like and not French. So in France, there was a tendency to really call out artists for technical errors, like here, the light and the rendering of space that they found flawed. They also would criticize artists for lapses in taste. So here they found that this red was just too garish and too overwhelming. But also in France, interestingly, there was just a culture of criticizing just for sport, just for making puns, making jokes, insults, like colorful, witty repartee. All of this was really part of the newspaper culture. Now in Russia, it was very different. Art writers avoided criticizing art. Their role was to encourage and support Russian art. And this was because the Russian Art Academy had just been founded in 1757. So the whole Russian art of this type was rather new. There wasn't a long tradition of art criticism at all. And so the writers who wrote about it in the newspapers or in other places, in journals, tended to describe the paintings for viewers who might live far away from the capitals, who might not have access to see paintings or sculptures and to see, they might not have access to artistic culture. So they wanted to educate and enlighten their viewers and not just tear down artists who they thought deserved their support. So in France, there was a much older tradition of art and art criticism. Critics tended to adopt a tone of kind of dismay and scorn. They would say things like, so many paintings on view, so few of them worth our time, things like that. They would tend to pan the works on view, and this was a chance for them to engage readers, to show their wit and to show how clever they were. So a lot of the critics, of course, were freelance journalists. They were trying to sell copy to the newspapers. And the newspapers, the dozens and dozens of newspapers in Paris in the 1830s were all had in very intense competition with one another. So these lively, witty, hyperbolic reviews that were just filling the French press, these were the things that kept writers and papers in business. So in this context of this really scathing art criticism that was prevailing in Paris, Briullov's Pompeii did really well. In fact, there were numerous mentions of it, some of them very long, sometimes 6 paragraphs about the painting. Sometimes a single newspaper would have multiple issues with reviews in them, and the reviews in several different issues would mention his painting. So sometimes a single newspaper might mention it 2 or 3 times. So just that kind of attention was significant. And in these reviews, there were some positive words. So the positive reviews, the positive mentions of his work, really everyone praised his draftsmanship. And that was a real strength of Briullov. His rendering of anatomy, which was the highest level of artistic training in the academy, His rendering of anatomy was spectacular, and we can see on the left this muscular back, right? The muscular legs. On the right, we can see this nude horseman going off into the distance. Even the horse is beautiful, right? We don't know why this man is nude on a horse when Pompeii is being covered in volcanic ash. That's just what academic paintings tended to have, but it shows his rendering of anatomy really beautifully, and also the drapery, right? The drapery was also beautifully done. So he was also praised for the complexity of the poses that he used. So the figures were often shown foreshortened, and that's what we see here. This woman in the foreground who seems to be coming out towards us out of the canvas. This man who's fallen from the chariot in the distance. Also, his body is rendered foreshortened, and also this young couple at the right. The bridegroom is holding his bride in his arms, and we can see that her body is depicted in a foreshortened manner. Briullov was also noted for his ability to group the figures in believable groupings with psychological interactions among the figures that convey their character, that convey a sense of family. So one respected critic wrote, "Handsome details, well-conceived episodes, combinations that are touching or bold, a strength of execution, particularly noticeable in the volcano's fire, a rearing horse, and several groups are worthy of his talent being encouraged." So at the time, the worst kind of attention that an artist could receive in the newspapers was not this kind of negative criticism, but was in fact silence. And so being ignored in the criticism was horrible. Briullov's closest competitor was this Belgian artist named Navez, who also received a first-class medal at the exhibition, and he was practically ignored in the press. Here we see his painting, his submission, very austere classicism, and it was mentioned rarely. It was mentioned as an example of outdated academic art, but never really discussed. So the amount of coverage that Briullov received in the press shows that he was a noteworthy artist. So another painting that had terrible reviews was this painting by Ingres, a senior figure in the French art world and a very controversial artist. The response to his work was highly politicized, in part because it was a state commission. So just to show you the impact of the negative criticism on every type of artist, Ingres, after this exhibition, never showed his work at the Salon again. And he closed his teaching studio and he refused any further state commissions. So he just simply had nothing further to do with it. Now, by contrast, one of the most popular paintings on view that year was the Execution of Lady Jane Grey by Paul de la Roche. And now his paintings tended to be historical subjects, which was, again, very prestigious. Here he's working on a subject from British history. His work was very different from Briullov's in that he tended to show intimate scenes. His drama, because it is a dramatic subject, his drama was very contained and very restrained emotion. So this was the new wave of painting, these more intimate historical scenes that made the large-scale work like Pompeii look kind of old-fashioned. But I want to emphasize that no critics compared the two paintings. These were considered two completely different categories of painting. Historical genre scene like this, which was small scale, 2.5 meters or so, compared to Briullov's very large scale history painting, which was 6.5 meters, right? Completely different category. So something else that I noticed about the criticism was that it tended to treat Briullov like a young artist. And this was probably due to the way that he was listed in this exhibition catalog. As we see here on the upper right, it says Briullov, a stipendiary of His Majesty the Emperor of Russia. And the critics tended to repeat that he was a stipendiary or that he was a pensionnaire, and they would, as a result, call him a young artist. And it seems to me that they assumed that he must have been in his mid-20s because all of the young artists from France who were studying at the French Academy in Rome were in their mid-20s. So I think that they thought he was one like that. In fact, he was 34 years old. He was not supported by a stipend from the Tsar. He'd been supporting himself independently for 5 years. As a result of this treatment as a quote unquote young artist, the critics tended to attribute the painting's perceived flaws as being the youthful inexperience. They would say that he was taking on more than he could handle. They would say things like better luck next time and sort of offer him advice on what to do. So interestingly, they criticized his work, but they identified him as a young artist to watch, which I think we can take as positive criticism. So another interesting aspect of the criticism that I found is that the French critics were often talking about this painting and insulting the Italians. So Briullov's success in Italy became the grounds for some of the nastiest attacks against him. They framed Italy as being old-fashioned, said that its arts were naive, that they were emotional, theatrical, and that France, by contrast, was up-to-date, sophisticated, rational, and very tasteful, of course. So this competitive attitude, it seemed to me, was clearly related to France's position in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. So Napoleon had of course, looted art from Italy to fill French museums. He wanted to make Paris the capital of the arts in Europe. Of course, after Waterloo, after the Congress of Vienna, France had to return the looted works of art to Italy. They still tried to retain some of them, but those works of art were gradually emptying from the museums over the next decade. And well into the 1830s, French museums were still trying to build up their collections. So at the time that this painting went on view, there were still hard feelings. The French critics would often try to justify the seizing of antiques, the antique sculptures and the Renaissance paintings from Italy by saying that Italians didn't value their nation's treasures. They would say that, for example, Monsieur Briullov's painting was a tremendous success in Italy, but that doesn't surprise us. We know that they remove paintings by the great masters from their walls every day. They cram them into attics in order to replace them with pitiful paintings by contemporary masters. So in order for Paris, in the view of these critics, in order for Paris to emerge as the kind of the capital of good progressive taste in art, Italy had to stand for bad taste. And included in that was the Italian praise for Briullov's Pompeii. So even if the Italians' praise didn't impress French critics, it seems to have had a factor in the painting receiving a medal. And this is just one last archival document for you. This is the report on the exhibition of 1834, which actually does have an evaluation of the painting. This is where the Director of National Museums would recommend paintings and works of art to receive medals and other awards. And he would send this to his superior, who would send it on to the king. So here is why Briullov's painting received a medal. The painting of Monsieur Briullov, young Russian artist, young again, representing the last day of Pompeii, obtained a great deal of success in several cities in Italy. He writes, the French public has perhaps not given such favorable treatment to this work, in which, however, it would be highly unfair not to recognize a remarkable talent. So he's not enthusiastic about it, perhaps, but he is recommending it for an award, a medal. And interesting, when I looked closely at this, I saw that the word highly unfair, highly had been crossed out several times in pencil. I think you can see that here. It would not be highly unfair, but just unfair for him not to receive a medal. In any case, he got the medal. This report was not public. It's just an archival document, an internal document. So you're really seeing it here for the first time. But since I mentioned the Napoleonic Wars a few minutes ago, you're probably wondering, what about the relations between France and Russia? That was certainly an issue. In 1834, memories of Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign were still fresh in people's minds. And here we have a scene of the Champs-Élysées in Paris in 1814. After the devastating retreat of the Grand Army from Russia, Russian officers occupied Paris from March to June of 1814. And this encampment on the Champs-Élysées was emblematic of their perception, the French perception of Russians coming to inhabit the City of Light. We see the officers and soldiers carrying on their daily life, and French civilians in the foreground. You can see here right in the center, these French civilians of various classes, almost like visitors at the zoo looking at these foreigners in their city. So it's also important to remember that some critics looking at Briullov's painting were thinking about ethnic stereotypes. Many Europeans saw Russia as having a quasi-Oriental status in relation to Europe. They would emphasize Russia's differences from Europe. Russia had an autocratic Tsar, it had institutionalized serfdom, it had the Eastern Orthodox religious confession, not a Western confession, Catholicism or Protestantism. And for these reasons, it was looked upon as very different from Western Europe. So critics or writers in general, French people in general, tended to portray Russians as brutal barbarians and submissive Orientals. And so this bled over into the criticism when critics said that Briullov, for example, he lacked invention, or they said that the overwhelming crimson and the extreme lighting effects, the over-the-top emotion of his Pompeii painting were emblematic of the innate wildness or the kind of barbarian quality of the artist. And they even interestingly called him a Cossack. Cossack comes up quite a few times in the criticism. And of course, we know that Cossack and Russian are not interchangeable terms. A Cossack, as we know from the Russian History Museum's recent exhibition at Selo, a lecture as part of this series from August by Brian Beck, dedicated to Cossacks. We know that Cossacks were a multi-ethnic group, that they were self-governed communities, or as he put them, military brotherhoods that were located on the southern steppes of the Russian Empire. Cossacks entered the French popular imagination in part due to their merciless attacks on the Napoleonic army during the retreat from Russia in 1812. So they also, of course, served among the military officers who occupied Paris, as we see here. And they were the subject of caricatures by many French illustrators, such as here, this Cossack cookery. Cooking over an open fire in the middle of Paris was a sign of clearly of barbarism and lack of civilization. They drew attention for their colorful behavior and for their exotic uniforms, these wide-legged trousers called charovari. So to French writers, such as this publication, right, the history of the Cossacks were emblems of emblems of Russian savagery. They were fiery and uncontrollable, and according to this author, Cossacks have a frightful instinct for pillage and devastation, which has become proverbial to modern people. So this Russophobic literature, and there was a lot more of it, these Russophobic attitudes were endemic in a lot of France, not 100%, but very prevalent in France. And so in the art criticism, by calling Briullov a Cossack and emphasizing his otherness, critics were trying to say that his bold canvas, The Last Day of Pompeii, was the work of a wild man. So we know, of course, Cossacks were not an ethnic group, but the French used it as an ethnic stereotype. They were suggesting that backwardness and excess were inborn traits, and that the subtlety and refinement of French culture were simply beyond Briullov. And now what the critics didn't know about Briullov, and here I am pointing out that he included a self-portrait in the Pompeii, in the painting of Pompeii towards the left. He's here balancing a box filled with brushes, paint brushes and paints on top of his head. What they didn't know about Briullov was that he was born Charles Briullov. He was the descendant of a French Huguenot family. The Huguenots were Protestants in France. Many of them had fled France in the late 17th century, including Briullov's family had left France in the 17th century. They made their way across Europe and finally settled in St. Petersburg in the 1770s. So Briullov continued to identify with both the French and the Russian sides. His family's original name had been Briullov, which we see here at the right. They simplified it to Briullov, which they spelled in a couple of different ways. In Russia, they spelled their name Briullov, which we see transliterated here. And when he and his brother traveled to Rome, they were given the Russified name Briullov, which he continued to spell in several different ways, as we see here. And he sometimes called himself Charles Briullov or Charles Briullov, or sometimes Karl in the Russian. So this really reflects his dual identity. So we see that these ethnic stereotypes in the French press were not only wrong, as ethnic stereotypes are wrong, but they were also complete nonsense. So what about Demidov, right? He was Russian, right? He was not French at all. Was he a Cossack? Was he a barbarian? No, he was not. So here we see a copy of a portrait miniature after a work by Lisinka de Mirbel, which appeared in the Salon of 1834. This work was highly praised in the reviews. Now, Count Demidov had been educated in Paris. He was fluent in several European languages. He traveled extensively. He was a dandy, and he was a fixture of European high society. Because of his aristocratic status and his patronage of the arts, critics called him almost French. They were very flattering towards him. And he really was quite an artistic patron, even at this young age. He was, in addition to The Last Day of Pompeii, he bought all these other paintings owned all these other paintings at the Salon, right? So the Lady Jane Grey, the painting that I said was most highly praised, he owned it already. The other painting that was equally praised at the Salon, the Death of Poussin by Marius Granet, also was part of his collection. And this painting on the lower right, this Races, this is a kind of a stand-in for two paintings that he owned by Eugène Lamy, a fashionable dandy painter who painted things like races and high society. So many critics mentioned that this young Russian owned some of the best paintings in the Salon. They praised him. They claimed that he would maybe start an art gallery in Paris. And some of them expressed concern that he might take some of these paintings out of France. So instead of opening a gallery, he actually sent most of his collection to the Villa San Donato, which his family owned. He just inherited it a few years earlier. It's right outside of Florence. Demidov went on to form a major collection of contemporary French paintings, French artwork in general. He collected Netherlandish old masters. He also had inherited 18th century decorative arts and works of fine art from his father and grandfather. So his collection became one of the largest and most admired private collections in Europe. But interestingly, Demidov did not keep The Last Day of Pompeii. Instead, he offered it as a gift to the Tsar. And the painting arrived in Russia even before Briullov had returned. The Tsar had the painting hung in the Imperial Hermitage, and we see it here in a watercolor to the right. A number of decades later, after other artists were also kind of competing with him for size, so we see the painting to its left is just a little bit bigger. That was a competition that Briullov had started. So when Briullov returned to Russia in 1835, he was welcomed as a hero. The Tsar gave him a diamond ring with the imperial monogram, gave him the Order of St. Anna in the 3rd degree for a distinguished career in civil service. These are both prototypes. They're not the actual awards that Briullov received, but just to give you a sense of his honors. At the Academy of Arts, there was a celebratory reception with dinner, speeches. They gave him a laurel crown. So he was really feted and honored in the Academy. And he was also named a professor of history painting at the Academy, which was the highest level of professor that one could be. And students subsequently flocked to study with him. So when I decided to investigate the reception of Briullov's Pompeii in Paris, I really didn't know what I would find. I was concerned that possibly delving into the painful history of this negative response to a national treasure might be risky. But what I found was that, in fact, some of the negative reception was part of a larger context that showed its significance in French culture and in the French art world, with what was going on in history painting within the French art world. But I also found, even more importantly, that it really was justified as being a landmark in the history of Russian art. So thank you for your attention. I hope that we might have some questions or points of discussion to handle in the next few minutes.
All right, thank you very much, Margaret. I feel very fortunate, and I'm sure that the audience shares my sentiments here, that we were able to see these archival documents for the first time. That's wonderful. That's very exciting for us. So we do have a few inquiries already, which I will get to in a moment. But for those of you who are still coming up with questions, we're going to give our presenter a quick chance to catch her breath here before delving into the Q&A. I wanted to again note that I have dropped the YouTube channel information in the chat. And again, this presentation is being recorded, will be edited, and will then be available on our YouTube channel. So if you had to step out for a moment, or you would like to delve into the presentation at another point in time, you are able to do so. Now I'm looking at the chat log here, and I think I'm going to begin with a question of perhaps artistic identity and expression. Lady Agnes asks, why is his lighting looked down upon? Renaissance religious art used shiny gold to glitter light. Making art shine reflected light was not uncommon. So why was it frowned upon within his work?
Right. Yes, you're right that dramatic contrasts of light and dark do enhance the emotion of the scene. You're absolutely right. So the technical issue that they were concerned about was that in paintings, warm colors like red, orange, and yellow tend to come forward in space visually, and cool colors like blue tend to move back in space. And so what he did, the flaw in their perception, was that in the distant background, he has red, which comes forward visually. And in the foreground up here, he has this kind of bluish, greenish bolt of lightning, and that visually moves back in space. So in their perception, that tended to flatten out the space in the middle ground and make it just not technically, it was a technically incorrect, right? He should have had warm colors in the foreground and cool colors in the distance.
Wonderful, thank you. So I am actually going to merge a few questions together. One of our attendees, who is writing from Washington, has an inquiry about this individual. Another named Marilyn, and then one more named Mary, are all asking about the artist's relationship with Countess Yulia Semyonova, who is potentially the model featured in one of the two figures in this work. Excuse me. Could you please speak a little bit more on her and her relationship with the artist and with the work that we see here?
Right, yes. So Yulia Samoylova was, yes, indeed a countess of his acquaintance. He did paint two portraits of her. The real expert on that subject is Kristen Regina. She wrote an article about the portrait in the Hillwood Museum that is well worth reading, and I would refer you to her article. I think it was in Apollo magazine. A number of years ago, but definitely worth looking at. So yes, Briullov had a certain ideal of beauty that she seemed to fulfill, whether she was the model for this painting or whether she embodied his ideal of beauty. It was probably somewhere between the two, but you do notice that a lot of the women in the painting to the left, right here, a number of the women do have very similar features, these very dark hair, dark eyebrows, and very pale skin that look a bit like her. it's an interesting observation. She probably would not, I mean, she certainly was not an artist's model, right? He had access to professional models that would have served as models for him. Maybe they did also fulfill his ideals of female beauty that we see embodied here. There's definitely a close relationship, but we tend to look at them as Briullovian beauties rather than specifically Yulia Samoylova herself.
Perfect, thank you. So now getting into this idea of criticism again, Conrad writes, at a later date, 1912, a critic panned Duchamp's nude descending a staircase as a, quote, explosion at a shingle factory, end quote. What do you think is the worst slam or piece of criticism that Briullov took? You get into this a little bit during the lecture, but do you have a personal favorite point of criticism?
Right. Well, the kind of criticism that was the worst was that people would say things like we don't even, this painting doesn't even deserve to be mocked. Like, people are jeering at it, but we won't even, it doesn't even deserve our attention. They would say things like that after writing 6 paragraphs about it. So, they would say things like that. One of my favorites was also that some people, like, this is an example of the kind of wit. Some people have compared this painting to an omelet, but we think it looks more like a bowl of punch. I mean, it's just silly, right? But this is what would sell newspapers. Another one said that, a better way to describe it would be an eclair. So an eclair, of course, means a cream puff, right? A kind of cream puff pastry, but éclair also means a bolt of lightning in French. So that was the kind of punning and wit that they would do.
I love that, thank you. So getting into this idea of artistic influence, Richard asks, do you find there to be any indication of the influence of Delacroix on Briullov's work at all?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. He might have had access to Delacroix's work in reproduction. Delacroix didn't travel to Rome, and to my knowledge, his work wasn't shown in Rome. We know that Briullov didn't, I discovered, I guess, that Briullov didn't travel to Paris. So he certainly would be aware of Delacroix's work, but Delacroix was not an academic artist, and Briullov was really was an academic artist. He wasn't really modeling himself on that model. And so I'm not saying no, but I'm saying that there were a lot of trends in the air that both were aware of in terms of literature, in terms of depicting things from subjects that were popular beyond history, that included literature and opera. So there certainly were parallels, but I don't think that he was looking at Delacroix as a model.
Wonderful. So 2 other attendees also have questions regarding artistic influence and different factors combining into his work. An anonymous attendee asks, to what extent do you think this work is the result of time spent in Rome, and how much of the technique is owed to training in Russia? Which do you find to be more influential? And then Denise has an inquiry about Michelangelo and frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, the figures wrapped in brown capes that are somewhat similar to the figure of God in the creation of man. So let's kind of go in with that theme of influence for a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind.
Right, yeah. Well, Briullov had been training at the Academy of Arts, and even before he entered the academy, his father had been teaching him drawing, right? So his training in Russia had lasted for decades. He had been in Rome for a few years, and it's hard to say, what percentage was more important and what percentage was what. So I think I would have trouble answering that question. Certainly his training, his background in the Academy of Arts was crucial. His study of anatomy, right, was important. His studying of perspective, his color, like all of his basic technique was from the Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. What he had a chance to do in Rome was, well, also in St. Petersburg, I'll mention that he would have had access to paintings in the Hermitage. So he had a chance to see old masters there, mostly Baroque works. But in Rome, he had a chance to work from antiquity. He had a chance to see buildings and really be surrounded by well, in Pompeii, right, works from the 1st century of the Common Era. And so that was something that he simply could not have experienced otherwise. He saw works, as you said, as another writer said, in the Academy. In the Vatican. So he saw works, yes, by Michelangelo, by Raphael. One of the projects that caused him to delay this painting was that he had been commissioned by the Russian ambassador to Rome to copy Raphael's fresco, the School of Athens. So he did a full-size replica copy of the School of Athens. So yes, he absolutely had Raphael on his mind too. Does this painting look like Raphael's School of Athens? No, not exactly, but he certainly had the Renaissance composition in mind. There were just a lot of aspects of this that were kind of like Renaissance art, although it has more of the Baroque drama that he would have seen.
All right, thank you. So Jan wants to know, have you found any examples of trying to give a, quote, actual reading of the subject of the last day of Pompeii, like it was done, for instance, in 1792 in Poland, in reference to the celebration of the first anniversary of the 3rd of May, 1791, Constitution against the threat of the Second Partition of Poland? So this is a Poland-specific question. And if we don't have an exact answer for this yet, of course, we can do additional research, follow up. But question of, again, the reading of the subject of the last day of Pompeii and its influences.
I haven't seen, I haven't seen any reading of this in regard to Poland, and maybe I'm not understanding the question quite right. So perhaps if I could get that question in writing, I'd be happy to try to respond to it after the event.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think we are going to leave off with one final inquiry here from an anonymous attendee. What happened afterwards to the artist? Where did he end up? How long was his painting valued for and appreciated by the public? And it's ending the question with the good ending, which is etc. So pretty much any direction that we would like to
yes, that is a great question. The painting has had, and then the artist himself have had their ups and downs in history. Immediately after the painting was returned to Russia, as I said, it was in the Hermitage. People would go visit it. Young artists would visit it. They would stand in awe in front of it. They would weep, and they would stand in front of it for a half an hour, for an hour, and just experience it. And so that was an important aspect. By the 1860s and certainly into the end of the century, this kind of painting was seen as, well, old school. It was seen as being overblown, melodramatic, too big, and not having anything to do with contemporary Russian life. So the painting of Briullov and his students were seen as kind of stagnant and backwards, because this, in part because this painting was so influential in the Academy, and because he'd received so much attention for it, many students and subsequent generations modeled themselves after Briullov and this type of work. So there was a sense in which it became so entrenched in the Academy that that there was a negative response to it and a backlash. So in the 1860s and especially the 1870s, we see a generation of realist artists emerging who are trying to make paintings about modern Russian life, to depict everyday scenes, to show peasants, to show the struggles of modern Russia, and to really emphasize contemporary society. So in that period, in the late 19th and into the early 20th century, this painting was really seen as negative, seen as old-fashioned and washed up. There's a whole subsequent history that I think I don't have time to go into, but what happened with Briullov afterwards, he went back to Russia in 1835. He was, as I said, a hero. He was an important professor, had lots of students, admirers, people gushing over him, and eventually, he was then doing a lot of important state commissions, including for St. Isaac's Cathedral and other major commissions for the state in St. Petersburg, as well as teaching. So he had a lot of responsibilities. And he, by the late 1840s, he fell ill. and became quite sick, and then asked permission to return to Italy, where he thought that the weather would help his support his health. So he spent a few years in Italy, but by 1851, unfortunately, he passed away. So he died in Italy, and this painting remained his most important work.